Jak ocenia autor, tak? Nowe światło. How do you find the new light in the organization? How does it develop? What do you think of the new lights recently?
The magazines that come out, the information they have, you could have read 30 or 40 years ago. There's virtually nothing genuinely new published today. And changes that have been made are not the result of their saying, well, we've thought about the scriptures and meditated on them, and we realize that this teaching that we have been promoting was wrong, and we apologize and want to bring out the true understanding of the matter. As an example, the text in Matthew 24:14, where Jesus says, this generation will not pass away until all these things shall be fulfilled. For decades and decades, they taught that that generation applied to people who lived in 1914. Initially, they said that it applied to people who had understanding and who lived in 1914, who could understand what they saw taking place. But the farther away they got from 1914, they decided that that wouldn't satisfy because the years were so many. So then after a while they said anyone who was at least 10 years old and who was living in 1914, because at the age of 10 they could have understanding of what they saw. And then still more years passed, and they said, well, actually it applies to anybody who was even born in 1914. But the years went by, and as of today, anyone who was even born in 1914 would be 93 years old, and there are very few people of that age left living. So it wasn't a love of truth and a concern for holding to the scriptures, but the embarrassment of the time that had passed and the way it made this whole teaching sound ridiculous. And now recently they have published a watchtower in which they have questions from readers, and they discuss the year 1935. Again, for many decades they taught that in 1935 the call to heavenly life ended, and from then on the call was for earthly life only. And now in this article they say we cannot fix any date for that. Why this change? Is it because they studied the scriptures and said, well, there's no basis for that teaching and we want to proclaim the truth? No, that's not the case. It's just, again, they found themselves embarrassed with a teaching which no longer had any basis for acceptance by anyone. The men on the governing body were dying. Of all the men that were on the governing body when I was on, only 2 remain there. The others have all died. Ted Jarris and Jack Barr are the only 2 remaining who were on when I was there. And Jack Barr's in his 90s and Ted Jarris is in his 80s. So they brought in new men into the governing body, and every one of them is supposed to be of the anointed with this heavenly calling. But all of these new men who have been brought in, every one of them was not even baptized in 1935. So once again, it's the force of circumstances rather than love of truth that brings about these changes.
Proszę bardzo. There is a short question, and a brother asks just for a short answer. Do you attend any Christian services, any church?
We have home Bible studies and meet together with others from our neighborhood, and we go through the Bible. We take a certain book or letter of the Bible and then go through it chapter by chapter and discuss it verse by verse, and we find that very satisfying.
Yes, there is a question that there are many sincere people, and there are such also in that gathering. And what a person has to do if he or she finds that in his or her religion there are some wrong teachings? It doesn't matter if it is a witness or an Adventist or Catholic. What he or she should do? Should he or she left that denomination because Revelation says and Isaiah says, come out of her? Or should he or she wait because there is a parable about net, yes? About people who were gathering dragnet, yes, about dragnet.
Yes.
That people were gathering fish, and some were received, some were rejected. Should he or she wait because God will judge, and he should stay, or should he leave such church if he finds some wrong teachings among many teachings?
If you read the letters of the Apostle Paul, he wrote to different congregations in different areas, and you'll find that in virtually every case, he shows that there was some difference of opinion and understanding among the people there. They had some misunderstandings on certain points. And in his letter to the Corinthians, he talks about how some had certain views regarding the Sabbath day, holy days, and others regarding the eating of certain meats. And he says that we should not judge our brother. The one who eats as to God, and the one who does not eat refrains from eating as to God. So he says, it is not up to us to judge someone else's servants. Every servant answers to his own master. And he says we shall all appear before the judgment seat of God in Christ to answer for what we have done. So he encourages that they should not let things divide them. And he said the main thing that they should be careful of is not to stumble their brother or sister. So he goes on to say that let each one be judged by his own conscience, because anything that is done with a bad conscience is sin. And so we have to weigh the matter when we see error in where we're going and attending. Ask ourselves, is this error sufficient that I cannot continue on? Will my conscience allow me to or not? And we certainly don't want to uphold something that we believe is wrong. If we do, then we're sinning, actually. He says, happy is the man who can make his decision with a clear conscience. But a man who has doubts is guilty if he eats, because his action does not arise from this conviction. And anything which does not arise from conviction is sin. So we have to ask ourselves, how serious is the matter? If it's something that is just a difference of viewpoint on some minor point, then we can pass it over. But if we really feel that it gives a wrong picture of God and Christ, then we could not support it.
For such open speech. I'm also thankful for translator, for interpreter, for his good work.
So am I.
And I have a question. I see that the Watchtower organization lacks Christ, simply lacks Christ, and is based on a teaching that you can be saved by your merits.
Yes.
Was it one of the reasons why you left the organization?
Yes, the teaching that we are saved by faith and not by works was something very important in my mind. And the fact that we are not under law but under God's gracious kindness was another very important teaching that caused me to see the falsity of so much that I had learned. And I would not say that Christ is lacking totally in their viewpoint. It's just that he is so obscured by the emphasis put on the organization. I know when I was baptized on January the 1st, 1939, was when I was baptized. And I know that when I was immersed under the water, I had one thought in my mind. From now on, my life belongs to God through Christ. And I endeavored to live by that. And for the rest of my life, I was conscious that I was God's possession and I had to serve under his son. And I tried to do that. And that's the reason when it came to a question of, will you obey men or will you obey Christ? There was only one way for me. There was no doubt in my mind I had to obey Christ.
Prosimy bardzo. There are two major questions. First, do two members of the governing body who had Polish origin, Dan Sidlik and Ted Jarrett, were of the reformers or conservatives? And the second question, are the two eldest members of the governing body people who are the most prominent members now?
Ted Jarrett and Dan Sidlik were very different persons. They were both of Eastern European descent, but Ted Jarrett was a very rigid person. He served as a missionary in Australia and was in the branch office there, and I have received many letters from people in Australia who knew him personally, and they all say what a hard man he was. And that was true on the governing body. He had that attitude. Go ahead. I remember one case where Ted Jarrett said, well, suppose this ruling does cause some hardship for a few people. He said, we can't be concerned about that. We have to think of this big organization that we have. So that the individual didn't seem to matter. It was the organization that counted. Whereas Dan Sidlik would often express a more liberal, a more moderate attitude, and he would often vote on the side that was in the minority. His daily work was over at the factory where they did the printing, and he was on the factory committee. And a close friend of mine named Tom Cabine worked in the factory, and he was the overseer of all the high-speed presses that the society had. And he said that Dan Sidlik, when he talked with him privately, would express his concern about things and how he saw so many things that were wrong. And he said, what we need to do is get down and study the Bible again and get back to the Bible. But he was very concerned about his position. And though he would talk that way privately, when he was before the governing body, he was very careful because he did not want to lose his position.
Are those two eldest members of the governing body the most prominent or the youngest?
Ted Jarrett is the most prominent of the present governing body members, and he seems to be the main one exercising control today. Jack Barr is a very mild-mannered person. He doesn't express himself very strongly on things. In fact, when he was being considered for nomination as a member of the governing body wrote to the branch committee in England and asked about him, and they said, well, he's a good brother, but he doesn't contribute much. He hardly ever says anything in the meetings that we have. So he was brought over, and he was the same way in the governing body. He hardly ever expressed anything, made any comments.
Proszę bardzo.